a quarto de hora temos que
chegar, eu posso dar falar.
E ele me tem diz
Ele tem diz alguma coisa. Será que precisa de ajuda, mandar alguém lá fora?
Em princípio, abrem a porta, deve ser fácil. Eu procurei, se calhar era melhor avisar o segurança que está alguém a chegar para não ver para facilitar. E estar alguém, se calhar, para receber e trazer logo para ele não se preocupar.
Amanhã.
E acho, se só o encerramento é às 5, o correio vai. E não tem intervalo, portanto, não é.
Só na primeira. Bastante. É meia hora para cada um.
20 minutos mais questões.
Acho que biomédicos.
Escrevi bem, mas ele disse-me que não podia vir, mas eu desejava boas. Essa das crianças.
Podemos esperar até às 20. Eu não vou tomar muito tempo.
Eu demoro 5, 6 minutos, portanto, mesmo que perca mais 7 no máximo. Ele também falará qualquer coisa palavras e não tem.
Não ficar muito. Se gasta até às 20h30.
Se não estiver mesmo a chegar, também podemos ficar em casa e começar.
Tem um programa para mudar aos menos.
Joana, um programa a mais. Um programa extra para
Olha, eu não tenho nenhum. Não tenho nenhum.
Um programa extra.
Queres começar ou queres que logo, logo, logo. Hello, I am Luisa Faria. I'm the director of the faculty, and I want to say a few words of welcome and celebration. Good afternoon and welcome to the Faculty of Psychology and Education Sciences of University of Porto, and to Portugal. Greetings, first of all, to our table members, especially to the director of the doctoral program in human sexuality, Professor Pedro Nobre, and also to the director of the Faculty of Medicine, Dr. Altamiro da Costa Pereira. It is an honor to share this table and this opening ceremony with you. I welcome also the national and international researchers and teachers and the students to this seminar and to the new edition of the doctoral program. This initiative was organized together with the Cost Action Training School 2022 European Research Workshop in Sexual Medicine that took place from 19 till today at our faculty. It is a privilege to host the 4th International Seminar of the Doctoral Program in Human Sexuality that aims to celebrate the 4th edition of this doctoral program, an example of collaboration and interchange of knowledge, practice, experience in teaching and research among different faculties of the University of Porto. One of the faculties is the Faculty of Medicine. Another one is the Biomedical Sciences Institute, also of the University of Porto. This is a unique program of this kind in Europe. This will be also an occasion to reunite science and practice in the domain, and a huge opportunity to exchange views, perspectives, models of intervention, and to share new ideas for research. This is also an important moment to bring together leading researchers and scholars from around the world to collaborate, to teach, to exchange and share knowledge, theoretical and empirical research findings, and also an important opportunity to graduate and postgraduate students. We celebrate also the 13th anniversary of the Sex Lab, whose director is also Professor Pedro Nobre. This Sex Lab is a good example of investment of the faculty in the development of this area, and also in the pedagogical and scientific training of students and researchers. So these are all good motives for celebration and for scientific exchange. And so I want to thank you all for your presence and wish you welcome and a good seminar and a good opportunity for exchange during this afternoon. Thank you very much. I'll give the word to Professor Altamiro from the faculty, director of the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Porto.
Good afternoon. Well, first of all, I'd like to pay my respects to the director of our faculty of psychology and education, Professor Luisa Faria, and the director of the doctoral program in human sexuality, Professor Pedro Nobre. It's a great pleasure. I was already here last year, and it's a continuing pleasure to come and an honor to be invited for this opening ceremony. First of all, because it is, I can hear and heard a vibrant assistance. It's not already very common to see such a young assistant and all very bright. Maybe it's related with the topic, but maybe it is also related with the kind of background they have and the kind of objectives and the knowledge and aspiration they all have as well. Of course, I'd like to welcome to Porto, to the University of Porto, and to Portugal, the faculty that I know that many people in the faculty, they come from abroad, from different countries and different backgrounds. And as it was already said, this is a rare program and an interdisciplinary one. And it is, but the future is totally interdisciplinary knowledge. And if we are addressing human sexuality, probably we are addressing as well the human condition, the women rights, women condition. We are addressing domestic violence, etc., etc. Maybe even we are addressing wars, because of course I am not. My background is a very different one. I was trained as a physician, but soon I became involved into epidemiology studies, and then biostatistics and medical informatics and this kind of stuff. But human sexuality is surely since Freud times, and many things evolved since him, but it is linked to the most deeper human behavior, including political. I'm sure I'm not, but maybe, well, the problem, of course, being someone from the data is collecting data. It is always the most difficult things, but I wonder if they would be collecting data in Russia. This would explain many aggressive behaviors. But nevertheless, I want just to thank once again and say it is a pleasure, not for me as well, but for the Faculty of Medicine to participate in such an important program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, good afternoon, everyone. We are all speaking in English, so this is an international seminar, but also if you words in Portuguese, actually, also boa tarde a todos e a todas. É prazer enorme estar aqui mais uma vez nesta quarta edição deste seminário, quarta edição do Programa Doutoral em Sexualidade Humana e quarta edição do Seminário Internacional. Portanto, bem-vindos e bem-vindas a todas. Vou agora mudar para inglês, porque a língua é de facto inglês. Gostemos ou não, isso é outra questão. So welcome everyone. I said just a few words, words in Portuguese. I will be relatively brief, although I have some slides to share for the ones who are not familiar with our doctoral program. I want to share a few important ideas, but before going there, before going into PowerPoint slide presentations, let me just share how happy I am to be here after almost 3 years of pandemic. This is actually not the first live session, because 1 year ago we had actually a public session exactly in the same place. The difference was that the room had probably a fourth of this present, so now it's almost completely full, and last year was about a third or a fourth of the audience. So it's good to see the interest, and I want to welcome, of course, the first year PhD students, because this is the main reason why the seminar was built, is for welcoming the new students of the PhD program.
But again, there's a lot of others here. I also want to welcome the course training students and young researchers who were in the training school for the last 3 days, full days. It's a great opportunity also for us to welcome you. So thank you for joining here at Porto University. Also a word for the students who are here from Introduction to Sexology and Clinical Sexology. Thank you for joining. It was almost mandatory, so I know that you need to come. So, but I think it's an opportunity for you to learn. So there's not many opportunities for you to learn with the quality and diversity of invited speakers that we will have this afternoon. I'll just want to very briefly say thank you for all the ones who help organizing. First, thank you to Joana, Professor Joana Carvalho. She will be moderating, so she will be all over the place from moderating the speakers and actually also in the closing session. I also want to thank to the Portuguese Society of Clinical Sexology, Portuguese Association for Parenthood, who were also together, and also to the World Association for Sexual Health, which is a strong international partner. I had the pleasure to be president of this big international real world association. And when I mean real world, it's not only the global North Europe and North America and some countries in Asia, it's really the whole world. So, and we have here actually the current vice president of the World Association, and I am actually the past president. So I think this is also an opportunity to say that it's important to continue doing network, whatever is the platform, the World Association, the cost, the training, etc., etc. Of course, I have to thank to Professor Luisa Faria and Professor Altamir Pereira, and actually also a word to Professor Henrique Cirne Carvalho, who's the director of the ICBAS, which is the third institution who is involved in the program. As they both said, I think this is a great joint venture and an example also for other opportunities, is that we need to come together and do more often this not only multidisciplinary, but interdisciplinary, I would say even transdisciplinary projects, not in education and research. So thank you very much for the help and the support since the beginning. We started in 2018, so this is the 4th edition, and it's continued to grow and to bring attention. So that's and attracting also international students, which is very, very important. And so, last word for our invited speakers. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for accepting, the ones who were involved in the course, which were most of you, but also to Charles Moser, who just happened to visiting Portugal. So this is also a new opportunity. We also have online, but sometimes people are just visiting, and it's also an opportunity. So thank you very much, Alain Giamy from France. I won't say much because Joana will introduce them, but a word for each of you. Alain Giamy, Vice President of WAS, I just said. From Paris, Charles Moser, the President of Diverse Sexuality Research and Education Institute from the US. Eric Jensen, who's usually invited for many of these events. So many of you already know Professor Eric Jensen from the Institute for Family and Sexuality in Leuven, Belgium. Professor Ethel Coelho from Forensic Clinical Psychology and School of Health in Edinburgh University, and Professor Pierre Bricken from Sex Research, Sexual Medicine and Forensic Psychiatry at the University of Hamburg in Germany. So you see, it's mostly European, but diverse of countries in the United States. Again, global North, not global South, but hopefully in the future we may have invited speakers from the global South. I just want to share a few slides. Let me just say welcome also the ones who are online. Didn't say this previously, but we are live on YouTube. That's why you're being recorded. And let me just for all of you to make sure or to be aware that this is being recorded and may be used afterwards in the future for educational purposes. So if you don't agree with this policy, please, you need to leave, because you actually, when you gave consent, there was written there, so just for all of you to be aware that you're being recorded, okay? So the doctoral program, I don't need to say, this is one of the first in the few in Europe, especially dedicated to human sexuality, and one of the few worldwide, actually. I already said this, but let me re-emphasize this. This was not possible if we were alone. So if it was only for the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences, this will not be possible, although we play a very strong role. But so this is the opportunity and the network, and with Faculty of Medicine and Abel Salazar Institute of Biomedical Sciences. Also, just to say, there is a number of research institutes from the diverse organizations which are linked with the program. And again, to say that the program is multidisciplinary in nature. So although we want to do more inter and transdisciplinary, we have clinical sexology, we have sexuality education area, we have gender and sexuality, we have sexual medicine, and we have sexual and reproductive health. And of course, the boundaries between many of these are not very clear, but just for everyone to know that all of these domains are represented in our program. As I said, we have strong international connections, first with the World Association for Sexual Health, which was a partner since the beginning, and I hope it keeps being a partner for the future, and other international universities. So we all work in networks. Unfortunately, some of the scientific committee members are not able to be here today, but I want just to say that Professor Conceição Nogueira, is a vice director, is let's say my very good friend, and also my right and left hand, and probably she will take over the PhD program in the future, maybe, we don't know, but other colleagues also. Professor Isabel Menezes will be in the closing ceremony, so you will know it. Also, to share that for the ones who don't know, we have a lab. Professor Luisa Faria just said at the beginning, the first words, we are celebrating 30 years of existence, so we're not a baby anymore, adolescents. Let's see how it goes. And just to say that Professor Joana Carvalho is now actually taking the lead, because she's the one who's now leading as executive director of the Sex Lab. If you want to know more, please just use your, how do you say this, QR codes to have access to both the program and the Sex Lab. And the final words just about the research center that we have of psychology, which I happen to be currently the director. It's called CPUP, but we, the PhD program and the Sex Lab group, we are all involved in this research center. Our vision is excellence within diversity, which I think it's also more or less applies to the PhD and our, and of course we do a lot of stuff, but I just want to show you what I think two important dimensions. One is that what we do is also linked with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and this is important. So this is not only doing research for the sake of research, although that is in itself very important anyway, but doing research that applies to several domains, and to several domains of the Sustainable Development Goals, both health, education, equity, gender equality, etc., both at the program and at research center. And we are growing in terms of internationalization, international cooperation in projects, in making science, producing papers, etc., etc. And I think this is also a very important message, is that the world is becoming actually much, how do you say the word in English? Small, but small in a say we are much close together. It's much easier today to be everywhere if you have internet connection and be linked with anyone. And so I think this is an important message, not only research-wise, but globally. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for your attention. We will right away start the session. So thank you again for everyone who's here and online.
Thank you. Muito boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon. I will just start, this role, okay? It's part of my role. And you are very welcome. And I have this special word to the new students of the PhD program in human sexuality. I will meet you very, very soon. But until then, I want to congratulate you because you are now starting a very, very important journey in your life. I hope it is a happy one, and I wish you all the best to the next 3-4 years of your life. And I also want to welcome this fantastic group of colleagues who decided to hide their faces over there. And I know that possibly most of you don't know, but you will be looking to a living piece of the history in sexuality research. So at least for today, you don't have to go to a museum and you don't have to go to a library to find very important people, very important names who have given a great contribution to the field, who still give a great contribution to the field. And so please use your time the best way possible to ask them questions, share your thoughts, as long as I give you time to do that. Okay, so I'll be here controlling your time and try to control their time as well. And I think we can start by our first lovely speaker, Alain. I will do a brief presentation regarding each one of our speakers, okay? So Alain, who is currently emeritus professor at the National Institute of Health and Medical Research in Paris. He is also the vice president of the World Association for Sexual Health, and he has written a lot of papers and also books. Some of them are actually in Portuguese, so you just have to Google it and try to find a topic that you enjoy. Okay, and besides this, he's currently coordinating an international network on health and citizenship among French persons that also includes our country, Portugal. So, Alain, please be so kind to share your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you very much, Pedro and Eric, for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come to Porto, and it's also a pleasure to meet again some friends, some old friends and new friends. And because we are not used to have very scientific discussion in the context in which we meet at the World Association for Sexual Health, which is the mixed organization. So I was very happy about that. What I want to share with you today is this project that you spoke about, which is about researching trans situation. But I am not, I will take the metaphor of gastronomy and the chef presenting his last creation, the dish which is taken on the table. So I will not do that. I will take you to the kitchen so that you see how the research is made, and and it is about trans health and citizenship. I will start. I live in France, so with the French quotation from a writer which is called Raymond Queneau in his book Zazie dans le métro, which is the story of a young girl of 7 years, and she is asking to her aunt, what is a homosexual? And the aunt responds, it's a man who is wearing blue jeans. So this is, the way categories are created. They can be appropriate and they can be inappropriate. But today, this was in the 50s, 1959. Today, about 4 over 5 men wear blue jeans. Does it mean that 4 over 5 men are homosexual? No. So it gives also the idea of the historicity of categories. Categories change. The other quotation is from Herbert Marcuse, one of the inspirators of the sexual revolution in the 60s. Say psychological categories have become political categories. So what I am doing here is a kind of auto-ethnography, which is reflecting about oneself, but not as a kind of narcissistic exercise, but trying to find the connection between individual history and global social history, how, in fact, how a personal history reflects and gives insight about the global, the general history. So this is a project, an international self-funded network about trans health and citizenship, which started about 12 years ago in France, and then by meeting friends in different conferences and places, it grew. And it was included Italy, Brazil, Norway, Portugal, Denmark, and Chile. So this is the project is still going on. So this is one of the results, and this is the other result. But what I will comment that later. But in order to get to that, this is 10 years work. So you see that 10 years work takes you to and other table, which means that you don't do it like that. It doesn't come from the sky. This is 10 years work, pleasure, pain, suffering, and different kind of situation. So about the problem of researching trans, which is becoming quite complicated now, we can say that in science, in social sciences and epidemiology and demography, sex, which is not a biological dimension, which is a legal category. Sex is what the doctor says when the child is at birth. They look at the genitals and they decide legally if it is a male or female. It's a legal definition. And if you cannot decide one or the other, then you don't know what to do. It's embarrassing for everybody. So sex in science, sex remains a major independent variable used in sociological, demographic, and epidemiological studies. And this scientific problem, because with the binary categorization, we cannot include people who don't recognize themselves or who don't fall into the binary categorization, even if they are small or different in different countries, of different size, a small proportion of the population. So the question of gender binary and gender diversity are an example of social challenges, scientific challenges, healthcare, discrimination, clinical practice, cultural and symbolic issue. In France, we have a social security card, and it starts with number 1 or number 2. So number 1 is men, of course, and number 2 is a woman. And then what happens if you change your number, or if you are not 1 or 2? You see, so this is a real problem for social security. So how to resolve the scientific issue based on a social political issue, taking advantage of partnership with the fields. So the research in trans issue has been the object of criticism in demography. Nomenclature is considered inconsistent. Intra-population difference are not always observed, and the full spectrum of possible body and mind and change are difficult to observe. And there is also, from the communities, a mistrust of researchers. So, and how shall we solve this question? I call it a kind of a political epistemology, which means that it's a researcher posture, which means transforming scientific practice, challenging critics of traditional research methodology and asymmetric posture between researcher, participant, subject, and object, etc. So there is, and now we, in medical, social research, we come with the question of the expertise of the patient, the expertise of experience, the experience as expertise, and then, as Bruno Latour would say, we are abandoning the asymmetric posture to take a symmetric, you say symmetric or symmetric? Symmetric posture, which gives an equivalent epistemic status to every form of expression and every knowledge, which is not simple. We are here in a faculty, in a university, I was trained at Sorbonne, with all the decorum, and we had, I was raised with the idea that knowledge and absolute knowledge was something that could not be challenged easily. So we need to negotiate in a situation in which recently the trans community says nothing about us without us. So what does it mean? Something about us with us, I would say, to try to establish partnership. And then we have some example of the way this was negotiated. But recently, a document from the National Academies of Science in the US established a 200 pages document about how making the critique of the binary categories and giving a suggestion, recommendation of how to move beyond the binary categorization in studies. So more positively, what could be a political epistemology, taking into account a historical perspective, things are not just here and now, they come from a longitudinal synchronic perspective, thinking about trans not as people, but as a dispositif. This is a Foucauldian, there's someone with an adept of Foucault apparatus, from thinking of the whole, the trans as a situation which is created by culture and society, which has medical, and there are controversies between medical professional and trans organization, between medical professionals, between trans organization, and including public institution, and to articulate quanti and quali analysis. So what does it mean to make a survey? Are we at the service of the people, or are we doing biopolitics, control of the population? We want to know who they are. We want to know, the hidden realities. And I was a public employee, an employee of the state, and the money coming from the search study came from the Ministry of Health because they wanted to know what are the risks of HIV among trans people. But since we did not know nothing officially about trans people, we needed to do a survey. What kind of, let's move out of trans, what types of partnership? And I give just two examples. One example is from the Amazon. You know, we have David Kopenawa, who is the leader of the Yanomami culture, working with the French anthropologist Bruce Albert, who worked for something like 40 years in the Yanomami indigenous territory, and Bruce Albert put himself at the service of David Kopenawa to produce a 500 pages book about the history about the Yanomami. And then in this book, there is 150 pages of how the relationship was established. What do? You know, it's not easy to come in contact with David Kopenawa in the back of the Amazonian, of the Brazilian Amazon, and to go into the secrets of the culture. So this is explained, and the book was published in French before it was translated into Portuguese. I don't know if it is published in English. Another example is Alice Goffman, the daughter of the late Erving Goffman, the big American, the famous American sociologist, and she made a study which is called On the Run, Fugitive Life in an American City, and she lived about 4 or 5 years with a gang in Philadelphia, and she's supposed to have participated to murders, to drug, etc. So, and then when she wrote the book, when she finished the book, she destroyed every archive because she did not want to put in danger the people. And now she is accused to have written a novel, not to have done anthropology research. So you see, partnership with groups is not easy. And I took two extreme examples, but this is to give an idea. What about gender identity and gender diversity? We know that it started at some point with transsexualism, and we cannot use anymore transsexualism, except in some country, because it's considered as pathologization. There is a challenge that there was in the DSM-5 and the ICD previous version, gender dysphoria, you know, and then there was also gender incongruence and condition related to sexual health. There was a movement called Stop Trans Pathologization. But now the new definition, just that was published a couple of days ago by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, is transgender and gender diverse, to include, you know, like an umbrella category. But then, if we have an umbrella category, how shall we find the internal diversity of this trans and gender diverse population? Because the work of a social scientist is, I mean, in my view, is to be critical of the discourse. How long do you have more?
Oh, you still have, don't worry.
What?
You still have, don't worry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Okay, so the question is, you know, for a social scientist to give, you know, to try to understand the diversity. And for a clinician, the diversity goes to individual differences. So we need to find something between the individual differences and the globalization of a population. An example, the NTDS in the US study, they had two approaches to understand categorization. One is to propose items to be checked by the respondent with 14 categories to be checked. And they did something else, which is to ask people, how do you define yourself? And they found, I mean, the sample was more than 5,000 people, and they found 500 different responses. So what do you do when you have 500 different self-reported auto-definition? Other studies, they use category. So we have the trans apparatus, and we need to establish partnership with all those organizations, but there is a risk that if you work with one organization, the other one will not accept to work with you because they don't work together. And in France, the situation was very complicated because there was a big conflict between the medical organization and the trans organization. They would not never speak to each other. So I had to be in the middle between those groups, and some accepted and others did not accept. So the protocol of the INSERM study was the identification of the apparatus, of the galaxy of the trans system, which means to identify the organization, and we identified about 18 organizations, some organizations having one member, in themselves, and identifying the medical and psychological system to establish partnership with them. Then, when we found the stakeholder, we include them in the creation of the questionnaire. So we had the conversation with them at every level of the fabrication of the questionnaire to see if it would fit with their need, with their expectation, with the political correctness, etc. We did a pilot qualitative study with the key opinion leaders of the trans organization. We established partnership with the medical people, and the idea was to ask them to distribute the questionnaire for us. So they said, okay, give me 50 questionnaires. So, and we don't know exactly which organization give what questionnaire, but what we know is that we know from the respondents from whom they got the questionnaire. If they got the questionnaire from a medical, if they got the questionnaire from a trans organization, or if they got it from a bar, from a club, And then we see that just with this indicator, we have differences. The people who are recruited by medical are not the same as the one who are recruited by the trans organization. It's between snowball and time location sampling, so it's not very pure methodology, but this is, an anthropological approach using epidemiologic, sociological instruments. So the objective was to create knowledge on the diversity of trans profile based on the hypothesis that the trans population is a diverse group, to identify the trans dispositif, including private and public sector, human rights, lifestyles, access to healthcare, health situation, sexual health, sexual life, etc. So, and to evaluate the experience of transitional pathway, which is called now gender affirmative process. So we created a steering committee who worked with us at every stage of the process, with informal conversation, interviews, and discussing the questionnaire, etc. This was duplicated in 7 countries. And of course, in different countries, it was not exactly the same protocol, because in those countries, the trans apparatus is not the same. We don't have the same problem in Brazil, and we don't have the same problem as we can have in France. So it was adapted. In France, the questionnaire 10 years ago was in paper. In Brazil, it was also in paper, but it was not self-administered. It was administered by someone. In Norway, it was on internet, etc., etc. So we have some differences, and the questionnaire have been distributed on a duration of 10 years. So the last one being Denmark, there is 10 years difference between the French and the Danish study. So one of the most important technique in this questionnaire was not to use existing category, but to ask people, how do you define yourself? And in France, we had about 500 respondents. We had about 200 self-definition. And we see we have what I would call the binary, we have the non-binary. Because when you have someone who says that I am a real woman, I am a real man, those people cannot be considered as non-binary. So because they have a vision of their gender identity as being binary. So we have all the respondents, and we have the differences between the sex at birth, but in Brazil, for example, we have different categories. For example, the travesti category, which is the central category, because the size of the word is the statistical importance. Travesti is the central category in Brazil. It's a political and subjective category. So we have it, and we have also it means male trans and male, and women, female trans and travesti. So we use this verbatim, this self-expression to construct categories, and we constructed those categories. One is a binary, including men and women. The other one is a middle category, which include trans men and trans women, which means that they take into account the sex assigned at birth. And then we have a trans, that we call trans category, which means that people who are outside gender. We could say no, that they are agender, but they don't take care about gender. They are not in the middle. They don't consider themselves in the middle of a pathway. They are outside this ID, and they are critical of the other category. So we use those categories to give as category to analyze the statistical result. And you can see that we have here the categories that were created, and which means that they don't have the same importance in different countries. For example, travesti exists only in Brazil. Agender, they exist only in Norway. And so we can see in each country the diversity of trans identification according to the sex assigned at birth. And we see that in all of these countries, the proportion are not the same between men, people who are assigned male at birth or female at birth, and then how those at birth categories express themselves in terms of gender. Another result, which is very important, and I give it as an example, it's the question of harmonization. And we asked if they took it with prescription or without prescription. And here we have the result of the without prescription. And we can see that, for example, in Brazil, the green category is the country in which the majority of trans women and travesti, 79% of the travesti use hormones without prescription, which is not the case in France, which is in blue, where most of the people use hormone with prescription. And there is almost no difference between subgroups, whereas in Brazil, the travesti and trans women differ from the other category. So what I want to give to underline here is that using the self-reported categories is useful. It helps us to understand the diversity of practices, of gender identity expression, access to care, etc. So we need to trust the people, and we need to work with them in order to try to describe the reality the closest possible, and to help responding their need. So can we choose religion, age, social class, race? Can I transition from my age to your age, for example? It's not possible. I cannot do it. I mean, so some groups may change what was given at birth, some cannot. And this is a question of what is constructed, what is not constructed, what is given and what is chosen, and what are the question is establishing new ontology. Thank you. 45 minutes.
You are
I'm sorry.
very good. So we do have time for maybe one or two questions or thoughts, in case you want to share some thoughts. Go ahead, be brave. No one else? No one? Well, I do have a question. It's not necessarily related to this. It is more with the personal experience you have doing this kind of work. And given that we have so many students initiating their, research projects and, in the early phase of the career, I mean, based on everything you have done in life and your personal experience as well, what do you think they should expect if they want to pursue this kind of research area? What should they expect? And so many countries, you have to put connections with so many countries.
I don't understand exactly what you asked, but I think,
It's going to be easy. Will they face many, many barriers?
when I started, I was not at the end of my career first. So I took some risk, and the Ministry of Health asked me to do it because I was the only institutional researcher that could do it, because they were used to give me pornography, swingers, everything that was, in the rubbish. So they give me trans. Please do it for us. We give you all the money you need. Do it. And then I quarreled with them because what they wanted is to know if the trans sex workers were using condom because we found that the female trans migrant from Latin America and having the experience of sex work had 30% prevalence of HIV, which is unacceptable, which is the level of South Africa, in the heart of Paris, And they asked me, please give us because we had the question of condom use. They say, give us the condom use so that we can adapt the strategy of prevention. And I say no, because it's not a question of condom, it's a question of dispositif. You need to change the way those people are treated because they have not the possibility to use condom. And you will not reduce the HIV infection because by doing a campaign about that. So, but what you can do, what I would suggest, do what you believe you have to do, but you have to ground what you are doing in the existing knowledge to show if you are repeating, to know if you are repeating what has been done, or if to justify if you don't do the same, because you need to justify why you don't do the same. When we started to ask the people, to define themselves in order to build the categories, it is because we were not happy of the existing categories. We thought they would not work, but this was a scientific and political discussion.
And you have the freedom to do it.
Yes, because in France, I was a tenured functionary and researcher, and they would not have sent me out of my institution, even if I had raped a young 5-year-old girl. Even if I had done that, I'm not sure I would have been sent out, because it's a very protected status.
Thank you.
Very good question.
So congratulations, Professor John, for your work. I had some questions about your research, because the population that was participant of your research, comparing Brazil and Denmark and France, for example, are almost the same. It was almost 300 and some people participating on it. Comparing Brazil to Denmark and to France, it's so different. There are a lot of differences because Brazil is a huge country, And we have a lot of difference when we compare the different regions in Brazil.
Yeah, but yes, it was not Brazil, it was the city of Rio de Janeiro.
Okay, it was.
Yeah.
That was exactly what I wanted to know. Because when you consider something about Rio de Janeiro and comparing it, for example, for the north of Brazil or for the extremely south of Brazil, there are a lot of differences about that kind of.
Yes, you know, they are, I mean, what I consider, I think there are more differences between, and I think the two extreme groups in Brazil are the trans men and the travesti. The trans men are educated, rich, and white, and the travesti, they are black or morenas, poor, having the experience of sex work. So we have some contrasts, including race, class, and gender inside Brazil. But you know, Brazil is a multi-racial country with high system of inequalities, and which you see that repeats in the trans population. And of course, we don't have the same problem in Denmark, because the race question is not the same as it is in Brazil, but they have the immigration question, you know, how the immigrants from non-Schengen region are treated in Denmark and how they are treated in France, you know, so we have this question, but it's not, what we want to do is not to compare exactly, but to show the differences. More that traditional comparison, because it is not the same protocol exactly, you know, because it's field work, it's not laboratory work, you know, so there are always some impurities in the recruitment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigado.
Thank you very much. So those who have further questions, please let's see if in the end we still have time, or at the very best, you can Google their names and try to find the emails. Okay, very, very easy. And they do have to respond. So our next presenter is Dr. Charles, who is board certified in internal medicine by the American Board of Internal Medicine. He is also a fellow of the European Community of Sexual Medicine. He's doing private practice as well in the field of sexual medicine. And he has authored and co-authored over, let's say, many works, okay? Also doing books, and currently he is the founder and president of Diverse Sexuality Research and Education Institute. And I think you can Google it and try to find more on the internet. And please, Charles, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Can you hear, people hear me? Okay. Excuse me. So I started off life as a physicist. I have a bachelor's degree in physics, and I always think people forget about this, but there was Masters and Johnson who wrote Human Sexual Response and Human Sexual Inadequacy. Do people remember those books? I read them like novels. I was so captivated by what they were doing and by sexology, which was in its infancy, that I decided to give up physics, and I decided to go into sex research. And in doing so, I realized I needed a license to talk to people. And that was my master's degree in social work. And of course, that was a great license, and we can talk about that. But then I went on and got a PhD in sexology, and which was one of the first programs out there. And then a little bit after a few more years, HIV, AIDS happened, and I was captivated to take care of those people. And I realized I couldn't do that as a PhD, at least not medically. And I went to medical school. And then I decided, okay, I went to medical school. Now the easy thing was to be a psychiatrist. I decided I didn't want to do what I did before and write prescriptions. And so then I decided to go into internal medicine. And then, of course, sexual medicine happened and my research took off, and I do a lot of different things. And in this particular case, I'm going to talk about BDSM because I had started out, that was my PhD dissertation. And very quickly, people came and wanted to know about sexual violence and why BDSM was not sexual violence. And this just keeps going on even today. And the obvious answer is the male dominant, female submissive example is what everyone wants to know, but I want to be clear, all the possibilities that exist. You can be sexually violent among two women, among two men, among trans people, all those things exist. And in case people don't know, this is what the acronym stands for. And we sometimes talk about it as kink, and I will probably use them interchangeably. There's a slight difference between them that doesn't concern us today. And people often talk about, when I talk to international audiences, I don't know how much it's like in your particular country. But in the US, when people are accused of sexual violence, they say, oh no, it was just rough sex. And you go, what do you mean by rough sex? Well, in this case, the woman liked it, didn't want the soft caresses, wanted something more forceful, and that was what I did. But so now the question is, how do you tell the difference? Because those people will come to you and they don't want to go to prison, they want to continue doing what they're doing, and you often have to evaluate. So the difference between rape and sex is consent, all right? Now, there are many people who will say, oh, I'm not into rape at all, I'm into consensual sex. But if you take a very proper history, in fact, you think there may be some interest in rape there. Now, I want to point out one of the most popular fantasies that people have, both men and women, is rape. All right. But I want to be really clear. I have never met anyone who actually wants to be raped. And in the fantasy, the rape happens. The person decides what's going to happen. They decide when it's going to happen, with whom it's going to happen, and then they if it gets out of control, they can change the fantasy. In a real rape, you have none of those options. You don't decide any of those things. Going on, it's the difference between violence, sexual violence, and BDSM is also consent. Now, if you would look at, if I would just show you a clip of a BDSM scene, you might well say, well, it looks like violence. In fact, if we go back to Freud, he said it just children watching sex will think it's an attack. And that's because you don't have context. I want to just emphasize at the bottom, if it's not consensual, it's not BDSM. But just because you're in a consensual BDSM relationship with somebody doesn't mean it was not violent. It doesn't mean that the person was consenting all the way through. Now, there's a distinction, and legally it doesn't matter, between intent and error. I really thought that she really liked it. I really thought this was a really, hot scene we were doing. And then in the end, I find out that she hated it, that she felt violated. I didn't want to violate her. I just thought this is what she wanted. There is a difference between intent and error, right? And especially if you want to think about it, we have someone tied up, maybe a gag in their mouth, and they have negotiated a scene, some sexual event. And when they do that, they try and be very specific. You can slap me, you can call me names, you can, but don't use the paddle on me. I don't like the paddle. All right. But slapping is great. And this is actually a true story. A couple met at a party, a BDSM sex party. They negotiated at length. I'm told it was over an hour of what would happen and what would not happen. And included in that was slapping. All right. Yes, slap me, it'll be fine. And you can, and the woman said, slap my breasts, slap my butt. I don't care. I really find that to be hot. What she didn't say was slapping her face was going to trigger her. Sometimes she knew about triggering, but sometimes not. And so as soon as this guy started slapping her face, and as I understand it, I wasn't there, by the way. I didn't do this. It's not me. As soon as he realized that she was not liking this, he stopped. All right. And I'm told he apologized, and there was a question now in this community of people who do BDSM of who was responsible. She, because she didn't say, don't slap me in the face, that's going to trigger me, or him because he didn't specifically say, slap me, can I slap you on the face? That became a question. And again, as soon as it was no longer consensual, it became violence. Even though both people sat down beforehand, said, here's what I want to happen. I want you to dominate me. I want to be submissive. I want all these things to happen. It was not specific enough. So now, and this was not me, this was actually an associate of mine who started asking questions. And the big question, and this top question, is difficult to get a good answer to, but is essential. If she was not consenting, would that be more or less of a turn-on? Now, in violent people, they will escalate the situation to the point where it's no longer consensual because they're aroused, John Money used to say, by seeing the fear in the person's face, right? And it has to be real fear. It can't be play acting. And if the person says, if she wasn't consenting, I'm not interested. I want to go find people who want to consent, who want to do this consensual. If they say, well, I wanted to do what I wanted to do, and I thought she was interested, but now I'm sorry that she didn't like it, but I thought it was what we had negotiated. Those are telling you that it didn't matter if she was turned on. It's part of the way you think about it. And so this leads to questions. How do you know she was really enjoying it? And there's a statement in among people who say, I took your lubrication, your wetness, as a sign of consent. Now, I know many of you are beginning students, but if you know the literature, you know that women lubricating is not a sign of consent. All right. So now now the average person may not know this, but that doesn't absolve anybody. Did she have a safe word? People know what safe words are? Yeah, okay. Did she have a safe word? All right. And by the way, remember I started this off by saying maybe she had a gag, maybe she couldn't really utter the word, but safe words can be other things. You know, you hold the ball, you drop the ball, that means it's no longer consensual. There are other ways of nodding or indicating that you're not interested. Remember, go back. If the person doesn't seem interested, and even if they don't use the safe word, a experienced dominant is going to say to at least to him or herself, is the person still into it? All right. You want, that would be someone who's experienced. When you have teenagers, unfortunately, they don't have experience and things get out of hand. The next question is, did she use her safe word? And how quickly did the other person stop? There's an argument in my researches in this area. It has to be immediate cessation, right? And remember, people are aroused. They sometimes call that arousal. I'll mispronounce it in French, but le petit mort, the little death. They don't hear. And she says, aardvark, the safe word. And he goes, what? According to some people, it's now violence because he didn't stop immediately, even though he may not have heard it. And then, of course, could she use her safe word? Did he put her in a position that she could not indicate clearly that this was no longer consensual? Okay, those are helpful questions. These are maybe useful questions. You may want to use them. And do people know what hard and soft limits are? Yes? No, I'm getting a lot of quizzical looks. All right. A hard limit, as I said before, is like, don't slap me in the face. I hate that. It's a hard limit. Soft limits are, I don't think I like pain, but I want to explore that. I want you to, it means don't start off with the cat of nine tails as hard as you can, but maybe a little flick and see if I like it. See if that turns you on at all. All right. Those are soft limits. Even with a hard limit, don't slap me in the face. At some point, the dominant may put his hand on her cheek. All right. Not because he's going to slap her, but because he wants to see the response. Now, if she grimaces and says, then you know that's a hard limit and you're not going to go there. But you sometimes hear people say, I didn't know that I really enjoyed that until you did it. All right. And again, this is an issue of a more experienced dominant and a more experienced submissive to be able to explore that. And it's usually not what happened in the case I described of the first meeting. Oh, we've been playing together for 6 months or a year, and I think I sort of know you very well, and I think I can read you very well. We're going to go a little bit further. And then it becomes sort of the issue of when you cross the line, right? And you'll hear dominants say, we were doing this for 20 minutes and I could tell she was turned on. Everything was going great. And then all of a sudden, I knew things were different. All right. Now, exactly knowing that, all right, is less likely to be violent and an error than if someone says, I thought she was enjoying it. And even though her body language changed and her statement changed and she used a safe word, I still thought she was liking. That person doesn't know when they crossed the line. And then did you do something which you did not negotiate? Now, I should tell you that even among experienced BDSM participants, you do negotiate, you don't always, or you can't always negotiate everything. But, and we don't want, or no one wants, I think, the scripted, all right, you're going to hit me with a paddle 3 times, then you're going to call me 6 names, and then you're going to, roll me over and have sex with me. That's not a very erotic situation. Or at least I don't think so. And of course, the question is, was there any use of alcohol or drugs? to change the person's perception, which may be why they couldn't say no or say the safe word or whatever. I'm going to now tell you about the unhelpful questions. Were you turned on? All right. It actually doesn't matter. You can be turned on or not. And it actually doesn't matter if she was turned on, if she withdrew her consent. One of the things that many people in the BDSM community talk about is that I've never used my safe word. It's a matter of pride that I'll take whatever is happening. All right. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but just because someone doesn't use the safe word or has never used the safe word doesn't help you in figuring out the situation. Did the dominant have a history of violating limits? And in the BDSM community, if someone new comes in, we'll say they're attractive, and they people say, I want to do that, I want to play with that person, and things go wrong. I can tell you, at least in San Francisco, it is everyone will know about it by the next morning. You know, so-and-so did it to me and it wasn't what I wanted, and we didn't negotiate it, and he violated my limits. And so the next time this person shows up at a party, no one wants to play with them because they have a history of violating limits. Now, people who know this are extra cautious about not violating limits. All right. Now, if you ask them, they won't say, oh, yes, I have a history of violating limits. Oh, okay. I have a history of violating limits. So you want to ask the question in a different way. And it doesn't matter if she says no or stop, because that's very common in BDSM as part of the fantasy of the whole thing. And whether she asked for it, whether she provoked you, immaterial. In BDSM, there are systems that people ascribe to, and they'll say, I'm into SSC, safe, sane, and consensual. Then you'll say, oh no, I'm into RAC, risk-aware, consensual. Those are, the RAC people tend to say, I'm a little bit more daring than the SSC people. And this is a new one, the 4 C's: consent, communication, caring, and caution, which I think should be part of every relationship, BDSM or not. In BDSM, which is a huge area and encompasses many things, there are styles. Consensual non-consent, people know what these are? Consensual non-consent is someone says, I consent now to do whatever you want, either for a period of time or forever. And you no longer have to get my permission. It's assumed that you'll get permission or that you'll know that you're violating, but they don't want that control. That's erotic to them. Variations of that are absolute consent and authority transfer relationships. Domestic discipline is a relationship where if people violate some set of rules, you expect to be disciplined. Usually spanking, paddling, something else. Often it is arousing, but it doesn't have to be. No limit scenes are just that, where you specifically say, you can ignore my limits, sort of consensual non-consent. We've talked about rough sex. We've talked about rape play. And one of the issues is how people define themselves. And I always find this interesting. You'll see an ad for someone who says, you know, Mary Jane, submissive. I want to be a slave. You know, it's like, wait a minute, isn't that a non sequitur? Do you want control or don't you want control? They don't say, Mary Jane, slave, I want to be submissive in my relationship. There's a distinction. One of the other issues is, even when you do everything right, you can still be triggered. All right, triggered is is one of those more common words, but triggered really relates to something from my past showed up, and oh, this is not what I want to do anymore, right? And unfortunately, there is not always a way of knowing, but all of us, I would hope, would have concern for our partner, and many people will have a first scene at a party, because at parties there are people called dungeon masters, and dungeon masters are making sure that things. 1 minute, no, finally. Ooh. I hope this was helpful, and these are my questions, and I timed it pretty well. And there's the BSRAI. We have time for questions?
Yes, you do have time, please. Have a question there and then.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was very clarifying. Thank you so much. So nowadays there's a map distributed pornography and BDSM content, and more often than not, it's not realistic. It's not, doesn't include aftercare and all those things that do make up the real BDSM. They're not presented in pornography. So how can we disconnect that content that teenagers and youths are viewing on the internet from the actual reality of the BDSM, considering that it's not really a topic that is accepted in school, for example? So how can we try to reach out to youths and make them understand what it is and what they're doing?
One of the things that all the BDS organizations that I know of do is education. Now, one of the unfortunate things is if I said, I'm going to give a lecture to teenagers and come down to my lecture, I'm going to explain to you what BDSM is and how to do it safely, I think the police would be waiting for us, right? So what we try and do, what those, not me personally, what those organizations try and do is find other teenagers who are getting more experience to talk to other teenagers. Because look, if I say, oh, come down to my lecture and I'm going to tell you how to submit sexually, I think everyone is going to sort of laugh and go, no, I don't think I want to talk to you. And I'm a physician and I have teenage patients, and so I'm always sending them to educational websites. I should point out that many of the BDSM films or videos actually do have some very good content in them. The unfortunate thing is all you can get for free on the internet are these little clips that show none of the good stuff. So this is a huge problem, and I don't have a complete answer. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. More questions.
Or just do another one if you want.
So this is more of like a sensitive topic, I would say, and because it relates to a kind of violence. It's about like extreme child play, for example, and there's a lot of controversy, specifically for the person who is the dominant one, not the submissive one, because it doesn't relate or doesn't translate in actuality to pedophilia. So this is like, I think it's that like extreme pet play. It's are the two ones that are connected to this, like in a stronger way, let's say. I think the rest of the case are normally passed on as more natural, let's say. So yeah, that fine line, how do you educate people on it perhaps? And what's your opinion, actually, if you want to give it? Mine, for example, goes more on the side of maybe it's something not really acute, it's something else. So how do you educate people on that difference? And on that possibility that it is something harmful in a way or concerning, not for the submissive one, but in terms of the dominant person. And yeah, how do you, the people that you work with are able to navigate this theme.
So let me just start off with the premise here, because I think that's important. I'm sure if I interviewed each of you individually, I would find an area of sexual interaction that you would say, I don't understand why people like to do that. All right. That's not anything I can imagine being sexual. And then what I think you're moving towards is what we sometimes call dominant daddy, little girl play, or maybe infantilism.
Like diapers and things like that.
Yeah, so that's called an adult baby. All right. And an adult baby, the big thing that you have to understand is you don't have a baby.
Yes.
All right. You have an adult. And you sometimes will see people having using language that's, goo goo gaga. Hey, wait a minute, I want to go for Chinese food tonight. All right. You then sort of sort that out. And I make the analogy. There are people who like to cross-dress. Right. There are people who like adult baby, which is a type of cross-dressing where they're now dressing as a baby. There's pony play, where the person dresses up or acts like a pony or a pet, and I see all these as similar phenomena. Now, some people go, I'm so against animal abuse, there's no pony play in my life. All right. Or people who say, I am so against adult child sexual contact, there's no adult baby going on here. All right. Now, people have whatever interests, sexual interests they have. It's their, we don't choose that. I always wonder, like, why do people say, like, gee, I really like those women with big breasts, or I really like women with really small breasts? How did that happen? How did we decide that, gee, that's a big thing? Or I only date women who are blondes, or I only date women who are models, or I only date women who are whatever. And once you understand that we don't choose any of that, we recognize it. Now, I don't have a value judgment about adult baby. I really don't want any babies hurt in the process. But if two people are adult and they want to change each other's diapers, go for it. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. So we now have to proceed. Okay. Thank you, Charlie. Hey. So I will briefly present to you Professor Eddie. Okay. So Eddie, professor at the Institute for Family and Sexual Studies at the University of London. Also, a senior research fellow at the Key State Institute, Indiana University. He established extensively work in many topics: psychophysiology, hypersexuality, risky behavior, sexual dysfunction, and so on. And he, along with John Bancroft, are the fathers of the dual-cultural model of sexual response, which I believe he's going to talk about. He is also the recipient of many important awards. And finally, he is past president of the International Academy of Sex Research, and currently he is the chair of the Scientific Committee of the World Association of Sexual Health. And please, Eric, be submissive with time.
I'll do my best. Thank you for that nice introduction, and it's great to be here, to be back. Let me see if I'll find the right buttons here. So today's program consists largely of speakers who have participated the past few days in a wonderful training school program that support from the EU, and very kindly hosted by Professor Nobra and Professor Cavallo. And I'll just show you a quick picture of the participants the past 2 days. So it's been already very intensive. We've had a lot of conversations about all kinds of aspects of human sexuality, and mostly involving PhD projects that the whole group is working on. And as I've been asked today to talk more, actually, I think I've posted myself, to talk about the dual control model, a model that I developed many years back together with my colleague and mentor and friend, John Bancroft. I think it's timely because I'm actually working on a new review article on this topic, and discovered it's actually been used quite extensively by other researchers, which I'm very happy with and proud of. So I want to just share with you the basics of the model, the basic idea, as well as some findings with this model. Well, I have some graphs showing that I use all the time to illustrate the basic notions of this model. But as it happens, the model was developed by me and John Bancroft many years ago when we both were at the Kinch Institute at the Indiana University in the US. And I visited like 2 weeks ago the institute there at the occasion of this the 75th anniversary of that place. And I was going through photos from the time I almost lived and worked there for almost 20 years. And I came across a photo that I thought actually illustrates the model really well. You will see this, the photo I'll show you in a few seconds, that it actually does have a safe word, or a stop sign, but that is definitely totally being ignored. This is what I saw one day looking out of my window while I was working on a grant application for the National Institute of Health. I was very focused, and this is in Bloomington, Indiana, where scenes like this are very common. And what you see here is obviously something I would consider, at least in one of the two animals, and I don't want to speculate about their gender, but one of them is definitely very excited, I think, high excitation, and definitely ignoring stop signs. And to some degree, those are some of the ingredients of a model, which I will explain a little bit better, maybe using this graph. The basic idea of the model is, as one of my colleagues very kindly explained yesterday to the students, or was it today? It's very simple. It's a very basic, simple notion. And the idea that sexual arousal, desire, related processes are dependent on the balance between the activation of sex, or sexual excitation, and the inhibition or the suppression of it. As I said, this model was developed together with John Bancroft, me, and actually, given the time, I'm not going to say a whole lot about sort of the background of it, so where does it come from, but it really emerged from our conversations and more or less boiled down to a realization that while I thought I had been studying processes relevant to the suppression or the inhibition of sexual response, in particular in men with erectile dysfunction. I think I realized in our conversations that a lot of my research was maybe more with factors and processes that interfere with excitation, that prevent excitation, not as much direct inhibition, which was something that John Banker was very interested in, and that involved, for example, a lot of that research was done in men who did not get erections in response to injections in the penis that were used back then to diagnose psychogenic erectile dysfunction, even though their penises were perfectly functional because they could get erections in other situations during masturbation. But those injections, which were smooth muscle relaxants, which should just give you an erection, whether you ask for it or not, they wouldn't get them. And that was a very different process, we thought. So there's more to this story, but basically it was from those conversations that we discussed or that we had, that we thought, well, we're really maybe talking not just about, in some situations, the inhibition of sexual response. Sometimes it is more about processes that interfere with the excitation of it. And I hope it will become clearer when I give more examples of the sort of research that we end up doing. So but this was a starting point. It was more or less a hypothesis, an idea that we had. Like we could study one of those two, but maybe we have to really take both of them seriously. Most research up to that point, I mean, there was research on sexual arousability, for example, but there was really not much research on processes that really are directly related to the suppression of sex, I would say. So the basic idea is that in every situation, there's a weighing of even now, here, the potential sexual cues probably from most of us in this room. But there's a break on it for most of us. There also, and this is the other part of the model, so sexual excitation is sensitive to the presence of sexual stimuli, sexual inhibition to potential threats or danger or risk. But we also, that's part of the model, we propose that people vary in the propensities for those processes. There will also be some people in this room who may be thinking like, if I would ask you to all just look at each other and see if you might find each other attractive and might want to have sex with each other. I think and it's we will differ in our reactions to it. Some of it you might feel, would you stop now, please? It's already starting to get a little starting to feel a little uncomfortable, while others may be thinking like, yeah, right? We're different, which is an essential part of this model and a starting point for a lot of our research. So sexual excitation, or the activation of sex, obviously is a key ingredient of most of our sexual experiences. It's also pretty important for the survival of our species, that sometimes we might get a little turned on and might want to do certain things sexually. From reproduction, sexual function, sexual intimacy, porn use, sexting, all kinds of topics that we've discussed also over the past few days. Something is being activated in our brain relevant to sex and sexual response, sexual desire and behavior. Sexual inhibition, and that's a part of the idea of this model, is also a useful, a good thing to have. It is something we consider adaptive. In some situations, it's better to not stay sexually aroused. When the house is on fire or the ceiling is about to come down, maybe you should give priority to some other things than your sexual engagement at that moment. But at the same time, we started also with this model, the idea that too much inhibition may perhaps make you more vulnerable to developing sexual problems, and too little, if the brakes don't work that well, may actually put you at risk of engaging in certain behaviors in certain situations, because you don't lose your arousal under certain conditions of threat or danger or risk, that you may engage in those kinds of behaviors. As a very simple example, if you're with a new person and you're having a lot of fun, and at one point the person says, let's continue, but I don't want to use a condom. then for some people, that's the end of it. They will actually lose their arousal also, right? Others won't. And obviously that is definitely one of the necessary conditions to continue, at least in certain constellations, to continue sexual behavior. So we first presented this model quite a few years ago at the International Academy of Sex Research meeting in '96. The model or the ideas emerged from our conversation in late '95 at the King's Institute. Then John Bancroft included it in a review article, and we wrote more about it in 2000. And but what we wanted to do was, okay, so how can we continue exploring these ideas? We can do it in psychophysiological studies, which we also explored, but also we wanted a questionnaire to capture those individual differences, that variability in those processes. So I'll tell you a little bit about those questionnaires. There will be a little bit of statistics in it, because I cannot tell the story without you understanding how we actually measure these things. So we wrote a number of items, questions for people, and basically they were all in if-then format. So if this or that happens, I easily become sexually aroused. If this or that happens, I easily lose my sexual arousal. And of course, life is complex, the world is complex, but try and just indicate, yeah, that's me. No, that's not me. Okay, disagree, agree. And we did a number of studies, all the statistics that were required, factual analyses, all kinds of test-free tests and other things that I'm not going to, at least try not to bore you with. But what we discovered, at least with the questionnaire that we had developed, is that we found indeed one sexual excitation factor. We found actually two inhibition factors that we had not really expected, but turned out to be very interesting. I'll give you an example: sexual excitation or sexual excitation skill, a number of questions, and they were about sort of if you meet an attractive person, if you hear an attractive voice on the phone, your response to visual stimuli, non-sexual stimuli. That includes, I think, a question like, I easily become sexually aroused just by lying on the beach, or, you know, and the whole idea is that maybe you think right away, huh? Other people think, yeah, that's why I stopped going to the beach. You know, we are different, and that's the whole notion here. Example question: when an attractive person flirts with me, I easily become sexually aroused. Then we found two inhibition factors. The first we call sexual inhibition due to the threat of performance failure. And that it's a very clinical term here, but the idea of not getting aroused or losing your arousal due to concerns about your sexual performance, or whether your partner is aroused or staying aroused. And it's like, I have to really stay focused or I lose my arousal. I compare this now more and more with sort of like the handbrake in the car, not as much, I'll tell more about it. The other type of inhibition is more like the foot brake. You can have sex, you can be sexually functional, or if you score high on this factor, if you have a lot of, you know, if you really have to stay focused, if you're easily distracted. But it does potentially interfere with sexual response. If I feel that I'm expected to respond sexually, I have difficulty getting aroused, as an example item. And the second one is losing or not getting aroused, or losing arousal due to the risk of being caught, negative consequences of sex, and to like STDs, and what happens with your arousal if you or your partner might experience pain. Now, obviously, or if something is happening that is in contrast to your values. This is complicated because obviously some people will indicate, yes, I easily lose my arousal if this and that happens. For other people, it may even be the opposite. It could be potentially arousal. If, for example, the item, if I can be seen by others while having sex, I'm unlikely to stay sexually aroused. Some people might say, no, it's the opposite. I find that eternal. But this is how we approach this. And what's important, I think, about the model in general with the data supporting this is that These are relatively independent factors. You can score low or high on both excitation and inhibition. You can be someone who's easily sexually aroused, but also this or that only needs to happen and you lose your arousal. So, which is really interesting. So it's not like it's one scale and, you know, if you're on one end or the other. No, you can, they're really independent. And the questionnaire was initially developed for men, later also tested in women, and studies there. Basically, all studies showed some degree of correlation between those factors, those scores, but almost all studies there are really low, generally low, with some correlation between the inhibition factors. And this is, I'm just showing, I'm not going to go into the actual numbers here, but this is a reminder for me to tell you that it is also relatively specific to sex. Some people may be very easily inhibited this or that, or not inhibited socially, or when it comes to other types of risk or dangerous situations. Well, thanks. But it's not necessarily that strongly correlated with other more general tendencies. Another important message is that this variability that we're seeing is really enormous. And we see that in all studies, this is from our own earlier work, this is from the representative sample in Belgium. You see a lot of variability in the scores on those questionnaires, which is, I think, a very important thing and to realize. And we find almost always significant differences between men and women, for example, or different sexual orientation groups, even with men often scoring on average higher than women on sexual excitation. But you know, the differences among men and women are much larger than the average difference between women and men. So if I go back, you know, the top two graphs show sexual excitation scores, and in all our studies we see that maybe 1/3 of women score much higher than almost half of all the men on sexual excitation. A lot of individual variability. Well, I only have a few minutes left apparently, so. And there's also a new questionnaire, which I will skip. The last review that we did, other people have written about in model 2, was in 2009. So now work, as I mentioned, working on a new review of papers. And since 2009, there have been over 150 studies that actually used by other researchers who applied this model. It has been translated and are made in a number of languages with all kinds of also factor analyses, mainly showing that to show that actually it's holding up pretty well. The different questionnaires that we have, including that new one, the factor structure, the basic idea that you can get scores from people more about the sexual excitation, how easily they get turned on, how easily they get turned off. That is holding up in different countries, different versions of the questionnaires. So the model has been applied and is being applied in various areas of research, like our initial ideas about how high inhibition might be predicting vulnerability to sexual dysfunction and low to sexual risk-taking. All constructs, these are all words, you know, these are complex things that we're talking about, and I realize that I'm very, you know, treating it in a very simplified way. Sexual risk-taking, and a lot of research is about condom use, for example, right? Sexual aggression, you could also consider, at least in many situations, a form of sexual risk-taking. Hypersexuality and asexuality. I'll give you a quick summary of sexual dysfunction, especially when it comes to problems related to sexual arousal, and it's mostly connected to CIS1, that first inhibition factor, that handbrake that's on, that may make it just harder for you to stay aroused and you easily lose it. Although other variables may also play a role. Sexual excitation is particularly relevant to desire problems. Low desire is very strongly connected to low sexual excitation problems. And high sexual excitation is very consistently associated with high levels of sexual desire. someone who says, not just today, right now and here, but in general, I have very high levels of sexual desire, sorry. There's a lot that can be said about the connection between sexual arousal and desire, which is a whole different topic. Sexual risk-taking, indeed, especially that second inhibition factor is connected to findings related to sort of condom use, etc. Sexual excitation too, but not as much. And in many studies, it seems that you know, it's not necessarily how easily you're sexually excited that determines those aspects of your behavior. The more risky aspects are much more determined by your breaks, you might say. Hypersexuality, a very complex topic in by itself as well, but there have been like more than 30 studies, and mostly using that first questionnaire that I showed you. And propensity for sexual excitation is really a very strong predictor of it. And even using multivariate approaches, looking at other things like personality and impulsivity, etc., sexual excitation. And so this is not our own work. I'm almost done. Yes, is very strongly predicted by sexual excitation. The way I look at it is that hypersexuality is strongly connected to very high sexual arousability. Whether or not you experience problems with that, whether or not that's associated with distress, whether it's associated with out of control behaviors from porn use, that's a bit of a different story. But it starts, there's definitely a strong component of you're a very sexual person. You know? That's what I think. I'm going to skip this. Asexuality, there's not as much work in it, but associated definitely with very low sexual arousability and sexual exploitation. Sexual aggression, we did the first study on this ourselves with Zoe Peterson years ago, where we actually found a connection between sexual aggression, sexual inhibition in particular of the second type, and also risky sexual behaviors. Is something that's understudied, I think, that sexual aggression or the transgression of sexual space, you might say, in many situations goes together with the lack of condoms also. There's often no condom use in those situations. So there's a lot of other aspects to this. We're currently, Axel is here, a new PhD project where we're exploring this in more depth. All right, I'm out of time, right? Shorter than I thought, but what I wanted to mention, and I'll just do it by having this a little slide in the background, is that the model is also impacting, or to some degree, different new developments and even the pharmacological development of new drugs. If that's a good development is a different question, but you know, there are drugs now available or produced that are more relevant to helping with low excitation or helping with high inhibition. And I hear from a lot of clinicians that also even in just talking with patients that is often very helpful. So like, is this more about sort of you're not getting the stimulation you need, the sexual stimuli that you need, or is that part maybe okay, but something else is interfering with it and suppressing it? There's a break maybe on, even though, you know, to explore those different sides is actually clinically used more often as well. I'll skip this. I do want to show this for just a second because there are various colleagues here who has actually tried to also really translate the model into clinical implications for treating compulsive sexual behavior disorder or hypersexuality. So it's holding up pretty well. It's not the basic ideas and the independence between those influences and the variability of, which I think is one of the most important messages of the model, is that we really vary in those processes, individual variability. And the specificity to sex, it is not just about how you behave in traffic, and this is about sex. And it is relevant to the prediction of different aspects of our behavior. There are a number of things that I think really be studied in more depth, including sort of how stable is this, like can life experience of influence your propensities, etc. And I didn't get to the part where the plot thickens, and no, plot is not a synonym for penis or. But I think I'll leave it to that. I'm talking about upwards, onwards and upwards. So I think there's a lot of interesting work happening with this model, and thank you for the time.
One question only. Come on. Okay.
Roy Levin, a physiologist, will always ask the standard question of, did you try this chicken?
First, thank you. I haven't dealt with this. More of curiosity because the majority of the works involves therapeutic actual. It's not about for sex, man, women. I'm curious about if there's in this is focus on these groups, on sex things, I know the first lecture said about dance,
Yeah.
but in the others here, maybe if there's a specific thought you studying about sexual
And other groups, there are publications on in which this has been explored in different sexual orientation groups. Yes, I don't know of research right now in like non-binary or trans groups. No, but that's up. I only have this much time in my own research to look at certain things that I invite anyone to explore the relevance of these ideas in different samples. But this being applied, it has been studied in lesbian women, bisexual men, and gay men, self-identified different orientation groups. Yes. I think what we might find is that there are different triggers, that are relevant for excitation inhibition that we haven't really looked at that much yet, but that could be looked at. There may be different, there are some statistically significant differences reported between different orientation groups. For example, in particular, bisexuality tends to be associated with higher sexual excitation. For me, the main message is not looking at those group differences, but more, you will find the same variability probably within all those groups. I hope that answers a little bit question, but I invite anyone to do more work with that.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thank you.
So I will quickly introduce you to the next presenter, Professor Ethel, who is Professor of Forensic Clinical Psychology in the School of Health and Social Science at the University of Edinburgh. She is also a clinical psychologist who has been doing work with both sex offenders and also victims. And she has been doing research for so many years in the topic of technology-mediated crimes against children, and also collaborates with both government and non-governmental agencies in the context of this kind of research, policy, and practice. She has been the recipient of many funded research projects in this area, and she also plays a very active role in the number of UK Home Office and Scottish government organizations. And she is the academic member of TikTok's European Safety Advisory Council. So Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's from the sublime to the ridiculous, essentially, isn't it? Because we've woven our way through quite extreme content in terms of the topics that we've been talking about. So mine is another shift. You've been very patient and we've been sitting in a very warm room for quite some time. So I'll try and be as quick as possible. And that's a picture of Edinburgh that is our official picture. And should it look like that all the time, it would be very nice. Okay. I'm going to start, in a way, some earlier conversations that we had today, and one particularly with Alain, really made me think a bit more critically about the theoretical context for some of what I have to say. And I think I would agree that theoretical models outside of clearly the work that we've just been listening about, and I know that others will talk too, it's not always easy to discern. And it made me think about, why am I starting with a picture of a camera phone? And camera phones feel very strange objects at this stage. And it's because what has caught my interest over recent years, I'll take my watch off so I can actually see how much time I've got left, has been the context. My area of work relates to online violence that involves children or artifacts that relate to children. And trying to think about this, a lot of the work has been related to trying to understand this from the perspective of somebody who, for example, is being convicted of crimes involving online violence, whether they may be the production of sexual images, or, and I know we have at least one person in here who's been doing work on grooming, so direct behavior online that relates to children. And we know that sexual offences are not new, that sexual offences involving children, historically, they run through all stages of our development in terms of how we are. But there is something new. And for a long time, we've been saying, well, you know, the internet is just another platform, you know, it's just another space. And in fact, in one of the documents that arose out of, I think it was the Third World Congress, that related to online sexual abuse, we were still talking about this, just this space. It's a space. It's like getting a bus as opposed to using a car. It's just a space. But the area that I think has driven some of the research, so in fact, because of that, our focus has been very much on offenders and offender characteristics, and a lot of work has been done now on risk and who is likely to go on from offences involving the online environment to offences offline, which we've always taken as being much more serious and worse. Or it's been more recently on victims. And some of the work that I want to talk about really relates to this notion of victimhood. And a lot of the push in relation to victimhood has always been about young people's responsibility in relation to their own victimization. So this is, and I promise you, I've stopped being long-winded now. What is interesting, though, in relation to this environment, that it increasingly impacts on everything that we do, it's interwoven into all of our activities, is how we use that environment and this interaction between humans and technology. And the theory that underpins all of this, which, just to pick up on the initial starting point, for me, is affordance theories. And when I came up to sit down on the chair, and I don't normally sit down to talk, I'm one of these wanderers, right? I'm forced to sit on the chair here because the microphone is at a certain level. If I stand up, you won't hear my voice. But when I came here, the chair has affordance properties that I recognize. And my most likely response is to sit on it. But equally, if I was reaching up and I couldn't reach, I'm only small. I don't normally acknowledge that. if I couldn't reach something, I may not use the chair to sit upon, but I may stand on it. So I use it as a platform. And if we think about this in technology, and I start with the advent of the camera phone, because that's what I'm talking about, something that relates to them. We know that 2000, 2002 mark a turning point in our ability to produce digital content. It almost made accessible for us some of the things that we now take for granted. And the camera phone was the first version of what we now know of smartphones, have properties associated with them that afford certain behaviors. So we've been out, this has been a wonderful meeting, we've been out for nice meals, some of us will have been taking pictures of the food, and we share it with other people to say, look at the amazing things that we've had here. This is a relatively recent behavior. It's not a long-standing behavior, but in fact, it impacts on so much of what we do. And there is a push. So if you use Instagram, there is a push constantly to be taking visual content and to share it with others. My involvement with TikTok is interesting for me because it involves the creation of short videos, but there is an audience. We're not creating them for ourselves, we're creating them for an audience to share with other people. So in a very short space of time, we see that smartphones have become part of our everyday lives. And if we went around the room, which I'm clearly not going to do, and said, could you wave your smartphone at me? I'm sure most of us here would have a smartphone. So 2022, smartphone is now if you like, the version, not a final version, but an intermediate version of our move from camera phones in a very short space of time. And these are now the most used layer of connectivity, much more so in lower socioeconomic groups, much more so in low, medium income countries, but for all of us, it's the main route that we connect with other people. It doesn't require us to do anything because we have our computer in our hand. And of course, smartphones have now become intrinsically associated with sexual activity altogether, which is your topic of interest. So we can create and we can share digital artifacts that to do with everyday life, but also including the sexual lives, our sexual lives, where digital media transform in some ways how we initiate, maintain, and actually end our sexual relationships. And we see this very much in our public gaze all of the time. And we know that young adults, much more likely than adolescents or older adults, but not exclusively, are more likely to share sexual images than any other age groups. So we've got something here about the increasing use of technology as a means to enhance sexual pleasure, sexual arousal, and sexual relationships. Now, we also know that we don't have something that says you can only have a smartphone when you are 18, right? We know that children's lives are increasingly interwoven with technologies. So we've got studies, for example, from the EU that suggests that most children are using smartphones daily or almost all of the time. And some of the Ofcom studies from the UK would say that in 2020, nearly all UK children aged 5 to 15 went online, with approximately over half having some negative experiences, usually being asked or being contacted by somebody to be their friend they don't know. Now, there has been a suggestion for some years that as practitioners, we need to start thinking about technology, the cyber system, as part of the ecology of the child. So using Bronfenbrenner's model, that we should extend technology across all of these systems. Although the focus has largely been on this microsystem. And there's more recent work by our own Tudge that I think is really interesting in relation to this. So we start to think about, and in the context of children, much of our areas of research have related to risk and risk-taking and harm. Risk and harm are not necessarily coexistent. So I've taken this just from the more recent work from initially it was the EU Kids Online project, but now it's the Global Kids Online project. They're really interesting pieces of work. I would encourage you to have a look. But they have looked at areas of risk for children. So sexual is the one that I'm focusing on, but they've looked at it in terms of content, of contact, so the child as participant, as conduct, as child as the actor. And this is important because a lot of what we know about sexual violence online relates to peer activity. It isn't simply, if I scrolled kind of back a few years, and every conference that you went to, you were given something like a mouse mat or a kind of, I don't know, kind of a data stick or something. And most of the mouse mats, I remember one very clearly showed man at a computer, a man who was a bit overweight in a vest. And it was clear that the suggestion being that this is where the danger lies. This is somebody pretending to be somebody else. But in fact, what we know is that a lot of the sexual violence that we see in this online space comes from other children. And we also have contract, which is something that we're only just starting to pay attention to, where you get breaches of contract that in fact, or not even breaches of contract, but where contract messaging is so poor that we don't know when in fact, I'm going to get a message in a second, right? When in fact there's been an infringement. So I'm going to focus just on what. So, but the bigger context of this is that the internet doesn't actually make children vulnerable, but there is a strong suggestion that it may make children showing certain vulnerabilities much more accessible. And there's a strong argument in all of this that we really do need to start to think about existing violence research in relation to this ever-permeating environment. And that's a really good book. And the vulnerabilities that we know relate to, and this does depend on context, on the type of online risk that you're talking about. So older teenagers, LGBTQI children, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to engage in, for example, sexting behavior and are victims of sextortion. Girls, much more likely to be victims of sexual solicitation, although there's a caveat with all of these. Where are these missing boys? There are questions here as to the adequacy of some of our data. But they're more likely, for example, to be seen in reports of cyber dating violence, more likely to be asked for kind of sexual images themselves. Okay, so some of the data that we have for various sources, because the data is quite difficult in this area. We either have conviction data, or we have survey data with children, or we have data that relates to content that's being distributed online. And I take this from the IWF, which is the UK mandated repository for image detection and management. In their survey in 2021, they found that 72% of the images that were both reported and their analysts accessed were self-generated. They were created by young people, and that was quite a substantial increase. So we have some indicator here that there is more content that's now being available and distributed that relates to content that's been created largely using handheld devices, but sometimes using fixed devices by young people. Why is this important? Well, we have been in our meetings at times talking about sexting, the sending, receiving, forwarding of nude, semi-nude images, sexually explicit images. In the US, some of the terminology that's still being used relates to self-produced child pornography, which I feel inherently uncomfortable with, in part because what makes it pornography in the name is its use by adults, not by other children. We talk about self-generated child sexual abuse material, overlaps with that. And then we have, now this is not without its considerable problems, a new definition from the Technology Coalition of Industry, so techie industry, who've called it perceived first-person child sexual abuse material. I'm not sure that that's going to take off, but anyway. And now we have from one of our parliamentary groups, because the UK at the minute is very preoccupied with online safety, first-person produced imagery. So we have problems with terminology and how that terminology positions both the child who is probably the agent of the imagery and also the reactions because of that. Now, one of the earliest pieces of work, and it's not that early, 2011 in this area, was done by Finkelthor, by Wallach and Finkelthor, and I'm sure some of you will know this, and it divided sexting into two categories. And one was aggravated, which involved either adults or where there was some malign intent to it, intent to harm or reckless misuse. And the other one was experimental. And that was probably the first acknowledgement that these images can be created in sexual relationships that have some meaning for that young person and where the outcome may not necessarily be negative. So you've got something here that says, we have a dilemma here. And I'm not going to go into this, but in the UK, we've now adopted Outcome 21 to make sure that children who are found producing images themselves or in possession of images produced by, for example, their partner, will not be prosecuted. Having said that, they will still be named and they will be recorded on police reports. And the law across all the countries is very confused and confusing. And particularly this is the case where, for example, adolescents are seen as both victims and perpetrators in terms of how we position these crimes. I'm going to have to rush because I can feel the vibes. Now, the suggestion is from our survey data that sexting rates are plateauing, that they're not increasing. So 1 in 5 youth now send, 1 in 3 receive, and 1 in 7 forward sex. And that was the more recent study by Molly et al., which was a meta-analysis. But we still are unclear about consent in relation to sexting and how much of this maybe is non-consensual or coercive. So we have a further meta-analysis that says prevalence of sexting has increased in recent years and increasing with age, but images can be produced coercively. And I need to hurry because I'm going to take time from here, which wouldn't be appropriate. Brief reference to a study that was done a while now, 2017, when we looked at the cases that were claimed by the UK from the ICSI Interpol database of children's images. We took 687 cases, 2/3 were female, and looked, these were cases that were deemed to have reached the criteria for illegality and were held by the police. And we had the possession of the images as well as the reports that went along with that, right? What we found out of these cases, this is not a representative sample, I'm not making any claims about this, but that nearly half were self-taken images, and the majority of these were coercively taken. And family members were the next largest category. So children under 7 in these images, more likely to be taken by close family members. 7 to 11, the majority of the images were taken by family members and friends. And as you got older, the images were more likely to be taken by the young people themselves, and the largest number in the context of coerciveness. Followed this up with interviews And I think what was interesting, it's only a small sample, it was a qualitative study within our 52 interviews. The majority of the children who engaged in sexting and sharing of sexual images of themselves, in fact, did not experience any negative consequences of any sort at all. And I think that's important for us to remember. But what we are increasingly seeing are cases of sextortion that link both peer-related behavior and with adults. And in some of the work that we've been doing recently, the number of cases involving others reaching out to children online that involve requests for images and threats then to share are actually very high. And we know that, I'm not going to go through these various, but we do know that sextortion in itself is associated with some considerable harm to young people. And is associated with self-blame, self-criticism, feeling of being enmeshed and controlled within a relationship and coming to an end. I won't talk about this case study, except to say it was a case that I was involved in. Most of the young people who shared images under a fairly coercive relationship with an adult denied that these images had ever been taken. And when confronted with the fact that images being held, they told the investigators, the police investigators, that they consented to give these images. So if we ask children, they would tell us that these images are created within a context. So they need a focus that takes into account their developmental stage, that there is proportional management of these cases, that there is an avoidance of a judgmental stance, that the associated feelings with these images being discovered is shame and humiliation felt by children. And we have such a long way to go. Children want images taken down. There is current messaging on online safety and victim beliefs that systematically blame young people for having taken the images in the first place. We have scenarios where images have been shared without somebody knowing, and then how do we disclose that, and do we need to disclose that? We have professional discomfort, lack of awareness, no language to talk about this. There are very few longitudinal studies, and there's no evidence-based interventions. And I think I leave the final thought only with Patch in Hinduja, who's saying, is it time to teach safe sexting? I leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's perhaps that's not what you know. Our artificial intelligence is the identification and how those things have to be incorporated into social media platforms such as TikTok.
Right. Okay. The development. What I would say is that there has been considerable progress, both in the identification and the takedown of abusive content involving children, and that would include sexting images, particularly where they meet the criteria for illegality. Where they don't meet the criteria for illegality, it's more of a problem. I would say all of the social media platforms are heavily dependent on their own algorithms to be able to identify, but they're identifying largely things like how much flesh is exposed, how much skin exposure is there, who is in fact in the images, how many people are involved in the images, what is some of the context and background to the images. And there are significant issues with this. It is not perfect, but the takedown of images is much higher than it used to be. So yes, technology has an important role, but going back to, and this is my strap line, going back to my model, the model that I made reference to at the beginning to do with affordances, there is increasing pressure on technology companies. And I think that pressure has to come from all of us, that we need smart design. We need to make sure that children are not exposed to technology where it is so easy to make mistakes and to get things wrong, and find that they then become not only victims, but perpetrators.
No more questions?
No, I think I probably silenced everybody.
Yeah, just remember that you can always email, okay, the presenters. Thank you. So our last speaker here, I'll do this presentation. So, Professor Pierre Buchanan, Professor and Chair of the Institute for Reproductive Sexual Medicine and Forensic Psychiatry at the University Medical Center Chapter. He's also a consultant for the ICD-11 Working Group on the classification of sexual disorders and sexual health. So he has been doing extensive work both in research and also in the clinical context on the topics regarding psychotherapy, pharmacological treatment of patients with compulsive sexual behavior disorder, therapeutic disorders, and also people who have committed sexual offenses. He is also an associate editor with the Journal of Sexual Medicine, and he's also enrolled in many EU-funded projects. And one of those projects is the Priority, which is about the prevention of child sexual abuse, where University of Portland is also involved. Thanks.
Okay, first of all, congratulations to this program. I think it's great, fourth time, and to the lab. And congratulations to all of you that you are here, still suffering from bad air, but good science and tech research, and hope that you stay with tech research for the next year. I have only 14 minutes left, and I promise I will try to hold that 14 minutes. So, but my topic was, I think you gave it to me, or you, Pedro, it's compulsive sexual behavior disorder. And I was involved in the process of ICD-11 development. So this is a conflict of interest. I was more involved in the area of paraphilic disorders, but also in compulsive sexual behavior disorder. What do we have? Is compulsive sexual behavior disorder something new because it's a new diagnostic category, or is it just old wine in new bottles, maybe mixed together in a sex lab somewhere here or somewhere else in the world? I would say, to speak easy, it's not a new diagnostic category at all. So we have descriptions that are more than 100 years old, Kraft-Ebing, for example. But, and I hope that you will find time to go more in detail. We, for the first time, I think, have diagnostic requirements that are really detailed. We, at the moment, cannot see all the detailed descriptions in the ICD-11 internet page, but more or less, it's a failure to control intense repetitive sexual impulses, urges, and that leads or manifests in behavior. So it's not only urges or thoughts, but it must be behavior. This is the central point: problems in control and behavior. And if you remember Eric's talk, then it will turn out that there might be some kind of model that could fit with this definition. And that leads to a situation where persons show repetitive sexual activities, have numerous unsuccessful efforts to control their sexual behavior, engage in this sexual behavior despite adverse consequences, and people suffer from this. So they have distress. This is the major second criterion. So we have problems with sexual self-control, and sexual self-control in general, like in the dual control model, and then distress, and also other problems, for example, in relationship occupational base. And an important note is the last sentence, which says distress that is entirely related to moral judgments and disapproval about sexual impulses, urges, and behaviors is not sufficient to meet the requirements. So you have on the other side a clear part of the definition that says, okay, if there are negative sexual attitudes that lead to a situation that on the one hand you have sexual behavior that's might be that people have the impression that it's out of control, and on the other side, negative attitudes towards sexuality. This is not enough to fulfill the criteria, which is important. It is described more in more detail in the guidelines. One of the first field trials showed vignettes to clinicians and then looked at the difference between correct diagnosis. And some of you might remember or already know that also in ICD-10 there is this diagnosis of excessive sexual drive. But there are no diagnostic requirements, there are no descriptors. So it's just this diagnostic category, nothing more. So if you see here ICD-10 correct diagnosis, when you present vignettes to clinicians, only around 50% make the correct diagnosis, while with its new diagnostic guidelines, around 90% give the right diagnosis. So that's pretty good, I would say, and it's comparable to diagnosis of schizophrenic disorder, for example. We, during the last 5 years, did the first representative German sex survey, and I was happy to include screeners for sexual dysfunction, but also for compulsive sexual behavior disorder, because I was part of this ICD-11 WHO group. And the question that we had in a representative sample was how many participants have experienced their sexuality as difficult to control over an extended period of time, and what distinguishes those that feel at least moderately affected, so distressed by this condition, from those that do not. So these are 3 groups, one without control problems, one with some control problems, but do not feel distressed by it, and then the third group, which would more or less with this very simple descriptors fulfill diagnostic requirements for screening of compulsive sexual behavior disorder. This is already published with numerous co-authors, like always in these large studies. And I will not go in detail because time to the Gazette study, but you can just look at the publications. There's a methods paper in the Journal of Sex Research, but also this homepage, and there's a film on the homepage, also in English language. So people had to rate, I experienced intense recurring sexual impulse urges that I had difficulty controlling, resolving sexual behavior. This is more or less the description that the ICD-11 shows, and then distress and impairment, so on a Likert scale. And what we find is what has been described since the 1980s, more or less, in the literature. So lifetime, around 5% of men and 3% of the women that reports experience consistent with these requirements. And for the last 12 months, 3% of men and 1.8% of women. This is much lower than a recent American study from Eli Coleman's group, for example, showed that found around 12% of men and I think around 7% of the women. But I still think that these numbers are even too high, and I will show you some other numbers later. When we look at the correlates we find that especially the role of strictly religious upbringing might have something to do with suffering or feeling distressed, or people that report a strictly religious upbringing. The third column is the column for those with compulsive sexual behavior disorder requirements. So, and the one in the middle is just feeling under control but not distressed, and the left one is no group. That is. So religious upbringing seems to be a factor. Then we find more liberal attitudes towards sexuality in the group that feel not distressed, so in the middle, and more conservative or sexuality, maybe hostile attitudes in the group that shows compulsive sexual behavior disorder requirements. And in this group, we also find that during the last 12 months, the highest proportion had received a treatment for depression or other mental disorders. What we did then was to exclude all participants that reported either a strict religious upbringing and a conservative attitudes towards sexuality to calculate something like a possible lower boundary for this prevalence rate. And then it even goes down to 1.6% of the men and 0.9% of the women. So that's much lower. It might underestimate the real estimation, but still it could, if you put this note into your mind again, it still could be more correct than the other one. And it's much, much lower than the one found in the Dickens study. Eric already mentioned this review, and I will just go shortly into that picture. So this shows the model idea, I would say, and the theory-based model idea that in patients with compulsive sexual behavior disorder, we have a disbalance between excitation and inhibition, which might also be associated with neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, very simply spoken, background factors like sexual abuse experiences, genetic vulnerability, but also negative attitudes towards sexuality or pornography, and that all together with using sexuality as a coping strategy, as a coping mechanism against negative moods like depression, might lead or come together with the situation that people feel distressed by using sexuality as a coping mechanism. What we all do, we all use sexuality sometimes as a coping mechanism. Most of us do now. There's a high comorbidity with other disorders that play a role. So if you look into this model, on the left side, there's borderline personality disorder, substance use disorder, paraphilic disorder. So a disorder that might lead to a situation of sexual disinhibition plays a role. But there are other clinical relevant correlates, for example, the risk of infection with sexual transmitted the risk of sexual transmitted infections, and also the risk of reoffending, and I must really say reoffending, so people that have already convicted because of sexual. When it comes to treatment, sorry that I have to skip some of the slides. When it comes to treatment, basically the idea is to bring this disbalance into balance again with psychotherapy and medication. And now we have a great new randomized control trial using selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and naltrexone and the placebo condition with these patients by a group from Poland. And it turns out that the medication works pretty well. What we know for years now from clinical stuff. And we also have psychotherapy studies Here's a recent review, systematic review in the Journal of Behavior Addictions from a German group where I was part of 24 studies, 4 randomized controlled trials, cognitive behavior treatment, like always, I would say, and then medication like SSRI and naltrexone, and the testosterone lowering medications only if there's a risk of sexual reoffending. 1 minute left. Upcoming is the World Federation of Societies of Biological Psychiatry guidelines for assessment and treatment of compulsive sexual behavior disorder, which also will recommend SSRI use and naltrexone use. And what we also have are now 2 studies that use self-help programs. One is this online self-help program that we developed at Hamburg and mentioned the retraining reduced problematic porn consumption, approach avoidance phase, very simple, no clinical population, but in a randomized controlled trial with the primary outcome of problematic pornography use using the scale from the other problematic pornography consumption scale. It shows the per protocol analysis of significant effect. So what we have, and these are my take-home messages, I promise I will in time, it's fine. We have this new diagnostic category, which is somewhat based on a model developed by John Bancroft and Eric Jensen, I would say. So this is pretty helpful to communicate to patients, but also for further scientific investigations. And Eric has shown that there are a number of studies that use the questionnaires developed at his lab. And the treatment approaches can also be based on this model to understand the functionality of symptoms, which is central. Sexuality is used for non-sexual things, to enhance sexual self-control, to decrease sexual urges and impulses. And there are manualized, but also individualized treatment approaches available. And I hope that you all will work with compulsive sexual behavior disorder patients or in research in this topic. And have a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Now he deserves the golden medal. I don't have one for you, sorry. Any questions? Bob?
Still have the Portuguese time.
Oh, okay. So I should not have felt
Yes, please. It's over there.
I was mentioning about categorization of the disorder. Because as I was reading about the criteria and I heard it's kind of subject to debate. The criteria making more of addictive disorders than other compulsive disorders. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Good question. The question was if the criteria might not also meet, as far as I understood, meet criteria for addiction. And I think this is a very, very long debate since the 1980s. If it's an addiction and impulse control disorder or a compulsive disorder, and you already see by looking at a compulsive disorder, which is grouped in the group of impulse control disorder, that is inconsistent. And the results, the scientific results are inconsistent too. I would say most speak against compulsivity and more for an impulse control disorder. So the concept originally, I would say, coined by this paper from John Bancroft, out of control sexual behavior, might really be most scientifically based. But especially from the field of those that look at so-called pornography use disorder, whatever that might be. And I'm not in favor of using this diagnostic category. Find a lot of similarities to other behavior addictions, but also to substance-related disorders. So I would say the distinction is not as clear. And that's for that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any thoughts? Not really. Well, then I guess everyone is really, really tired, right? You can actually keep your questions and use the faculty of this university to answer them, whether you are on the licenciatura, but also if you are on the PhD program, okay? So thank you very much.
Olha, tudo bem, e eu sigo, eu nem tenho papéis com nomes femininos. Portanto, só vou mesmo agradecer. Não é? Obrigada. Então, eu acho que nós já estivemos, nós somos batidas nestes ensinamentos, sou Joana. Se eu tenho que passar, são quase
Pode ser em português, em inglês.
se quiseres, sim. Se vocês quiserem.
Prato em português também.
E querem que eu faça o quê?
Não, faça em português, que é um statement. Eu olhei para ele e disse, não vou lá para vou fazer em português.
Eu também já se estão a ir embora.
Pois, vou ser muito breve.
Nós estávamos a falar de onde é que nos foi aqui. Nós já somos batidas nestes ensinamentos.
Se só ficarem aqui os convidados, eu vou ter que fazer em inglês, porque estavam para ir embora.
Estás a ver porque não foi.
De repente, ao final do dia, mudar os 5 em inglês. Se calhar faço o inglês, uma vez que estão convidados ficaram, porque os miúdos estão a ir à vida deles.
É como vocês quiserem. Eu faço em inglês na boa sem fazer grande esforço, portanto, se vocês quiserem, eu também faço em inglês e vocês seguem em português ou inglês como quiserem.
Posso ter umas palavras de inglês, não ser umas coisas meio atrapalhadas.
Se calhar estamos já, que o pessoal vai.
Sim, eu acho que sim.
Okay, so let's try to come to the closing session. Thank you everyone for not leaving the room. And it was obviously a very long day for you, and it's again a great pleasure on my part to be here and to join this event that yearly shows not only the debate that is brought by our annual guests, but also the interest that this generates in us on our students. And so again, I think I want to thank the organizing commission to say it's a pleasure to be associated as the Research Center in Educational Intervention, to be associated with this event and with the doctoral program, and to hope that this was also inspiring for those of you who are starting the PhD and the master in this field. And for sure, I hope that in a few years, we will start having our own guests and we will come together and discuss your research and your contributions to the field. So thank you, yeah.
I will start to apologize myself because I will do this in Portuguese, sorry, okay? Boa tarde a todas as pessoas na sala. Eu estava exatamente a desculpar-me por fazer isto em português, porque o ano passado acabei por preparar e fazer isto em inglês, e depois acabei por ser a única e senti-me um bocadinho desconfortável, e portanto desta vez estou igualmente desconfortável, mas vou fazer em português, e tendo em conta que percebi que vocês são todos e todas umas resistentes e uns resistentes e que não pretendo alongar muito, vou fazê-lo em português. Vou apenas ter como objetivos 2 notas. Primeiro, agradecer em meu nome pessoal, mas também em nome da APF, da Associação para o Planeamento da Família, que é quem represento aqui hoje, e a primeira nota vai exatamente para que este possa ser também um espaço para que as pessoas possam ouvir falar da APF, e para quem não conhece a APF possa ter a curiosidade de nos vir conhecer. Hoje em dia, e ouvíamos hoje durante a tarde falar dos desafios que as novas tecnologias e os telefones e as câmaras representam, mas também as vantagens que isso pode trazer, e portanto procurem-nos através da internet, através das nossas redes sociais. Desde 1977 que trabalhamos e temos como missão trabalhar as questões da saúde sexual, dos direitos e da saúde sexual e reprodutiva, das questões da igualdade de oportunidades para todas as pessoas, tudo que na área da sexualidade humana diz respeito. Por isso, dar-vos a conhecer a APF, dizer-vos uma segunda nota: nós trabalhamos muito questões, temos muito trabalho próximo das populações e próximo de populações muitas vezes mais vulneráveis face a diferentes fenómenos. Trabalhamos também, desde há muito tempo, que uma das nossas bases de trabalho são as áreas de educação. Este é, por si só, um contexto de educação e um contexto de aprendizagem e um contexto de investigação. E, portanto, nós só nos podemos congratular em que, ano após ano, vejamos abrir este programa doutoral, porque as nossas intervenções, pretendemos sempre que as nossas intervenções sejam efetivamente baseadas em evidência científica. Portanto, precisamos que pessoas como vocês estejam interessadas nestas temáticas que são também as nossas, e que possam fazer investigação no sentido de que nós possamos basear nelas as nossas intervenções e, quem sabe, partilhar também connosco e trabalhar também connosco nas próprias investigações que produzimos, porque tentamos também não só disseminar o conhecimento que vocês possam vir a produzir e basearmos a nossa intervenção nele, mas também nós próprios podermos produzir novo conhecimento nestas temáticas. Obrigada a todos e a todas.
Oh, I will be fast and I will speak in English, because now we have, such a beautiful, European and also American team here, and we still have some of the cost students. So as you realize, I am now playing the second role of my pay, and I'm here to represent the Portuguese Society of Clinical Sexology. And because I am representing, this national institution, I must say I am really, really proud of everyone in Portugal. And I mean, all the professors, all the directors, those who are in charge in the institutions, in other institutions as well. And I am very proud of the Portuguese students, because we are working very, very hard to disseminate knowledge in sexuality and also sexuality research. Right? And usually when I approach my students for the first time, I always say to them that we are obviously a very small country, very cute also, but we are very, very big in the way we disseminate knowledge. And I will give you some examples, okay? So let's say we have very new teenager ways of promoting knowledge in sexuality, also sexology, which is a little bit more specific. We have this great example here at University of Porto of the PhD program in human sexuality. Is a teenager, right? Fourth edition. We do have a newborn, which is a master in sexology. We did not start it yet, but it will walk very, very soon, give the first steps. And for those who are eventually on YouTube and who are in the south of Portugal, there is another baby, which was a partnership between this society, my society, and also the Faculty of Medicine in University of Lisbon, which is a post-graduation course in human sexuality. And then I will talk about the old ones, the classical ones, and some were actually created maybe when you were, not you, okay, you were babies. When I was, a baby, and that's why I am very proud of them. So we have a great example at Lusofna University, master's degree on transdisciplinary sexology. And then obviously we have the very, very old advanced course in clinical sexology given by the Portuguese Society of Clinical Sexology, where people can receive the title of sex therapist and use the title in Portugal. It's not mandatory to use the title, but it is a recognition that you might receive based on knowledge and also clinical training, because you do have to do some kind of clinical training to receive this title. And this is only part of our story in terms of teaching and educating. I know there is a huge limitation here. All of these opportunities that I mentioned are located in the big cities in Portugal. I hope I can, change that in the near future. I hope you can change that in the future as well. And to give you an idea, we are not far away. We are not distant from other European countries in terms of offer you opportunities to know more about sexology. Okay, so actually, when I had to work on the new master in sexology, and we have to search from other countries in Europe who also offer this kind of teaching opportunities, there are not many countries doing that in this very structural way. And maybe there are not many countries with this very long tradition, very old story, preparing and give you these opportunities. So I want you to take this, final message that one of the reasons right now we are creating these new opportunities is not just to improve your professional lives. I know that you search for this kind of education because you might have better, personal careers, but we are also doing that because we are absolutely sure that sexology and human sexuality is also a matter of social responsibility. And we know that knowledge in this area is a very strong tool to promote sexual rights and human rights. So it's not only about knowledge, it's not only about receiving training and improve our clinical skills, it is about doing actually something in this world. And that's why we need, everyone, the young people here, the new generations, basically to do better than the things we have done in the past. And this is my final message. Thank you, everyone.
Fica até falando, uma questão desse também. Pois, devíamos cruzar-nos por outros motivos também, não era? Mas pronto, quanto mais não seja. Obrigada. Até logo. Tchau, Fabinho. Tchau.
Sim, as pessoas que realmente as voltas do ano passado.
Veio o Alban também da Símbolo, que está tentado para os tópicos em inglês, mas depois temos aqui já faz 50% de malta estrangeira, e assim é provável, aliás, eu fiz questão de começar em inglês, mas é provável que eu estou habituada a falar inglês e a trabalhar quando necessário em inglês. Meu, eu não preparei isto, sabe aquelas coisas que eu venho para fazer e que à partida, o ano passado eu trouxe 3 ou 4 linhas, porque em inglês pelo menos tem 3 ou 4 linhas orientadoras. Passou a mensagem e eu acho que destas gerações daqui para a frente isto vai levar a estar. Eu neste momento, eu própria, noutra área completamente diferente, já fiz meu doutoramento há muito tempo, ou seja, eu gosto independentemente da área. Eu não consigo dar resposta